Breaking news now, the Department of Justice has discovered new exculpatory evidence in the persecution of General Michael Flynn. This is more exculpatory evidence. It just keeps bubbling up from the Department of Justice, including notes from Peter Strzok and Dana Bowente. Well, joining us tonight to take this up, KT McFarland, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump, Sara Carter, investigative reporter, Fox Business contributor. Great to have you both with us. And I want to start, first of all, KT, right now we have two carriers in the South China Sea.
Yes.
We have a phase one deal that was historic in January, in which it now is on life support at best. Your thoughts about what is going on in the relationship between China and the United States?
Well, President Trump isn't backing down. I think this is what's so important for people to realize, that the Chinese are trying to use the pandemic. They plan to come out of this in 2 or 3 years' time, having supplanted the United States as the dominant superpower in the world. And one of the ways they're trying to do it is by seizing control of the South China Sea and basically turning the world's most important maritime trade route into an internal Chinese lake. So they get to decide who sails in the South China Sea or not. That's why it's so important that President Trump has reinforced, it made the message very clear in sending the two carriers into the South China Sea. We're not leaving the South China Sea, guys. We're not leaving the Pacific. And President Trump continues to stand up to the Chinese, which is so critical right now, especially as we're struggling with a Chinese origin pandemic.
And we're getting almost zero reporting from U.S. sources on the South China Sea, where military exercises are also being undertaken by the PLA, the Chinese Navy. What is that about?
Well, they don't. This is not
KT,
a good news story, right? Well, I think what that's about is that the mainstream media is not going to talk about it. It's not a good news story for the mainstream media, because it is a good news story for Donald Trump. He's standing up to him. They don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about schools should never open. Oh, the American economy is in the tank. Oh, this is so horrible. They don't want to talk about a strong national leader who is standing up for the interests of the United States.
And they don't want to talk, Sara, either about the fact that Christopher Steele, the ex-MI6 agent who concocted the Russian collusion dossier and created all sorts of fiction to the consternation, obviously, of everyone who cares about truth, being ordered by a British court now to pay off the businesses that were remarked on in his dossier.
That's right, Lou. I mean, I think that was a great segue, you know, going from China to Christopher Steele, because overall what we're seeing here is a mainstream media that is refusing, like KT said, to report the truth. And what we know now is that in London, Christopher Steele was basically hammered by a magistrate, ordering him to pay over $22,000 to each of the defendants involved in the case of his dossier, which has been completely debunked. You know, Christopher Steele, it should be even so much more, because when you think about this, it's not just a piece of paper with a simple lie. This basically put our nation for the last 4 years, Christopher Steele, the Democratic National Committee, and Hillary Clinton, and everybody involved in this has really created divisiveness in our country. They lied about General Flynn. He lied about Carter Page. He lied about everybody that was involved in the dossier. And now, whether or not Christopher Steele will have to make any kind of statement here in the United States, I mean, he is obviously not going to want to do that, but we know now for certain that this dossier is debunked. Unfortunately, so many people's lives, including KT's, including General Flynn, everyone else, have been turned upside down by these lies.
And not one of the SOBs is in jail, nor does he or she look like they're headed in that direction. KT, I want to go back to China. The amount of money that's being sent by Chinese immigrants back to China without, mostly untaxed, we're talking billions and billions of dollars. We're talking about Christopher Wray, who says that the FBI doesn't need any help in dealing with the espionage of the Chinese and surveillance of the Chinese. and their cyber attacks in this country, all of which have gone without response by the United States, and which is costing us somewhere around $500 billion a year that the Chinese continue to steal. What in the hell is going on in this government?
You know, it's just stunning to me because President Trump is the first guy to have stood up to the Chinese, and he's not backing down. He's not backing down no matter what happens. And to have the director of the FBI, who I think he's got a lot to answer for, frankly, on why the Department of Justice and the FBI have not pursued investigating the investigators as they should have done, why the FBI never turned over that exculpatory information to
I mean, that's one side, but I'm talking about national
Yeah.
security here. I'm talking about China, and I'm talking about a damn fool sitting in for Congress and saying that he's not worried about $500 billion in the theft of U.S. intellectual property. He's got plenty of people to take care of that. Meanwhile, the FBI hasn't been able to do a damn thing about cyber attacks or intellectual property theft.
You know, but this is a really big deal, because the next war is not going to necessarily be fought with aircraft carriers and missiles. It's going to be fought in cyberspace and with economic tools. And the Chinese are developing those tools, and the intellectual property theft continues. And for the director of the FBI to say, oh, that's not much of a big deal, you bet it is a big deal, because what are they stealing? They're stealing weapon systems. They're stealing weapons designs, R&D that costs us trillions of dollars, Lou.
Sarah,
KT.
Yes,
I just wanted to go right off of what
Sarah,
KT was saying.
You
She's
get the last
absolutely
word.
right. Oh, I was just going to say what KT is saying is absolutely right. Our research and development, our theft of intellectual property, Lou, is something that we have to focus on when it comes to China. And remember this, China is taking advantage of the chaos now and the divisiveness in our own country. This is what the Dems continue to instigate. So nations like China, Russia are taking advantage of that and taking advantage of this time to expand their reach in the world. And we have to be able to put a stop to that. It is a national security risk for us, and it's something that needs to be investigated.
Yeah, and somebody should tell Mark Esper, the head of the Department of Defense, that, you know, we do have combat photographers in all of the branches, and that if the national media won't cover a carrier task force in the South China Sea, then he sure as hell should be doing so. KT McFarland, Sara Carter, thank you both. Appreciate it.